Donald Trump is leading us down a path of authoritarianism. And today's guest, Steve Levitsky, well, he has spent decades studying how countries slide from democracy into authoritarian rule. He's a Harvard professor and one of the world's leading experts on democratic collapse. And today he's here to explain what authoritarianism in America would actually look like, what the Trump administration has already set in motion, and most importantly, what we all can still do to stop our democracy from dying. But before we get into it, subscribe to this channel to stay informed about how you can defend democracy. Professor Steven Levitsky, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
You are one of the world's leading authorities on democratic collapse, which I hate to say is a very pertinent topic for me and for the work I do and for many people in our audience. So I think the place to start this in framing is where you see the United States today. If healthy democracy is at one place, one end of the spectrum, and authoritarianism is at the other end, like how should people view where the U.S. is?
First of all, I mean, we need to put it in a little bit of perspective. Two things we know about democracies in general is that old democracies never die and rich democracies never die. No democracy, even remotely as rich as the United States, has ever broken down in the history of the world. And no democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. So the United States should be safe. And it has a lot of things going for it, which we could talk about. But the level of extreme polarization, the pretty dramatic erosion of basic democratic norms in the United States over the last decade or so, and I think most importantly, the radicalization of the Republican Party to the point where the bulk of its leadership is no longer committed to playing by rules of the game. And we had a big test in 2022 because the cardinal rule of democracy is you accept the results of elections. And the bulk of the Republican Party refused to accept the results of the 2020 election, or went along with an effort to overturn the results of the election. So at the very least, the foundations of our democracy have come unmoored. I would say over the last 10 months, the United States has crossed the line into a very mild form of authoritarianism. We can, what I call competitive authoritarianism, which is a system where parties continue to compete in elections, but incumbents so systematically abuse their power, weaponize the government, and use it to punish critics and to bully and threaten rivals, that the playing field gets tilted. And if you ask me to characterize where the United States has gone in 2025, I think we've slid into a very mild and reversible form of competitive authoritarianism. The amount of abuse, the attacks on media, on critics of the government, on universities, on law firms, has been so systematic that I think we've crossed the line.
When democracies are undermined and do slide or collapse, I can imagine sort of two scenarios based on my own kind of thinking about this in advance. One is that you have kind of a uprising of the population. In other words, the democracies can't withstand the popular pressure that is coming up from underneath them. It is harnessed by a strong man or a populist, dictator type, and that's how democracy dies. In that sense, it dies through democratic elections in a way, in that the populace comes to power in democratic elections and then they kind of wither away. The other is kind of the opposite, right? Which is that there's essentially an elite takeover, whether it's a coup, a formal coup, or just a sort of an elite class that refuses to allow there to be competitive elections and the like. Am I right that those are the two models, or does one of those tend to be really where this originates?
I think it's changed over time. So both of those and various configurations of the two have happened throughout history. During the most of the 20th century, especially during the Cold War, you had a fraction of the elite that would seize power from above. Your second scenario, military coups. Now that would sometimes be in alliance with the elite, with the rich. Not always. Sometimes the military itself would just decide that the country is ungovernable and seize power. But Most democracies died in the 20th century at the hands of some fraction of the elite, very often the military, seizing power. In the 21st century, it's been much when elections are much more widespread, much more legitimate in the world. Most democracies have died at the hands of elected governments. You kind of painted a Perón or Hugo Chavez or more recently Bukele like scenario where a large majority of the population sort of overwhelmingly elects and supports some populace who then goes on to undermine democracy, and that happens. But in a lot of cases, the level of popular support isn't so great. Rather than a massive majority in favor of the autocrat, you may have a really polarized situation, like in Poland or in Turkey, where you have two sides that are just deeply polarized, and one of them seizes power and abuses it. And that's closer to where the U.S. is, right? Because Trump has never been overwhelmingly popular.
The person that I most oftentimes hear Trump's critics compare him to, and interestingly, the person who I oftentimes hear Trump's allies compare him to is Erdogan or Orban, right? So you have these sort of two figures, one in Hungary, one in Turkey. Tell us a little bit about whether Turkey or Hungary fit the model that you are describing. I don't think of either of them having quite the history of democracy that we do in terms of length or civil institutions. But why did those two names keep coming up as people describe Trump and the current U.S.?
I think they are among the closest comparisons, that they are examples of democracies. Hungary was a bit of a stronger democracy than Turkey, but democracies in which you have leaders who were freely elected. Both Erdogan and Orban were freely elected in fully democratic systems, who, from once they were in power, gradually first politicized, weaponized the state, packed courts, politicized, placed loyalists across the bureaucracy, and gradually used a weaponized government to tilt the playing field against their rivals. The Turkish regime is a little more repressive, meaning there are many more people in prison and jail for political reasons. The Hungarian regime is really unique in that Orban has managed to keep his hands remarkably clean. He's never stolen an election. He hasn't put anybody in prison. He's done it entirely through hardball politics, by constitutional reform, by court packing, and by engineering behind the scenes to make sure his allies own all the main media, and also through gerrymandering. Orban's been, phenomenally successful, and he's been in power now for 15 years, and it's really a pretty stable competitive authoritarian regime. But he's nowhere near as openly and egregiously aggressive in his authoritarianism as Trump. So, Orban doesn't send the National Guard or ICE or any equivalent into the cities to intimidate people. Orban has not prosecuted critics or investigated and prosecuted many of his critics the way that Trump is attempting to do. Orban is not, to my knowledge, I don't think he's sued any media companies. He has worked behind the scenes to put his friends in control of major media. But the kind of really aggressively authoritarian stuff that Trump has done over the last year is you don't see in Hungary.
And so turning to the United States, I've been a big critic of what I will what I think of as like civil society, right? The role of law firms in capitulating, the role of corporate leadership, sort of being willing to not just capitulate, but actually collaborate, sort of enter into joint ventures with the administration. Universities is so far a mixed bag. You're at Harvard, which continues to stand up.
Pretty bad overall.
Yeah. Um, and to me, that has been the greater weakness of our democracy. It's been the private institutions relative, for example, to the courts, which I think have held up not perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but you continue to see an independent judiciary. Congress has really not held up very much at all, although maybe there are some signs of life there. Uh, what do democracies die because the formal institutions of government collapse, or because the civil society groups of democracy collapse?
That depends. They die in various ways. I mean, sometimes again, leaders use force. They are able to mobilize the military, literally to shut down the Congress or the courts. Sometimes they have the votes in Parliament to pack the courts, or to establish a super majority in the legislature that allows them to rewrite the rules of the game. Orban had a super majority in Parliament and could do whatever he wanted with the Constitution. Eventually, Hugo Chavez did the same things. In many cases, you just impose your will either through force or through legislative majorities, and that's the easiest route to authoritarianism. The reason why the United States is different and kind of puzzling, and I agree with your point of departure here, is we have really strong institutions that Trump did not control, and we've got a really strong civil society. One of the reasons why rich democracies don't die is you tend to have a lot of financial and organizational resources out there in society capable of resisting an autocrat. But the problem in the United States, I think we had both the institutional and societal muscle to contain Trump. And I think, we probably still will. But it's been a much, much messier year because of this abdication, I would say, by both state and private elites. The decision of the U.S. Senate to acquit Trump after he attempted to overturn the first president in the history of the United States to try to overturn an election, a direct attack on democracy, direct violation of the cardinal rule of democracy. The U.S. Senate let him off. Could have done what the Brazilians did and prevented him from ever running again. Didn't do it. The Supreme Court's derailing of the most serious cases against Trump in 2024, and obviously the extraordinary ruling on presidential immunity in 2024, I think is another case of abdication, although I agree with you in general that the courts have been very, very important. Congress's utter abdication when Trump nominated for his cabinet people who were not only unqualified, but who were clearly and really openly committed to carrying out an authoritarian project, authoritarian measures. The Senate could have blocked them and did not. And Congress's virtual silence until very recently, as the Trump administration openly violated the law and usurped legislative powers. Our institutions the leaders of our institutions have abdicated at key moments. And I agree with you that you could say the same thing about our societal leaders, beginning with the billionaires who bent the knee right after Trump's election, media companies, some law firms, many universities who have fired their presidents or changed their rules or acquiesced to illegal authoritarian bullying on the part of the administration. Institutions that had the muscle to fight back didn't do it. And that allowed Trump, I think, to get away with much more, even than the administration anticipated that it would.
I want to get your reaction to and have you contextualize the following observations I have about law firms. Donald Trump went after a handful of law firms, and some of them fought back and some of them capitulated. What happened next is another group of law firms openly capitulated without ever being threatened, right? I mean, like people don't realize, Paul Weiss was threatened and it capitulated, and I've said every bad thing I possibly could say about Paul Weiss. But Skadden Arps was never threatened. I mean, Skadden Arps just made a deal, and as did a number of the large law firms. But behind them are another 100 to 200 law firms that have never been targeted. They've never made a formal deal, but they have clearly changed the kinds of pro bono work they will do. I wonder if that is how that fits into democratic decay or undermining democratic institutions. I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Steve Levitsky in a moment. But I started Democracy Docket in 2020 with a simple goal: to bring you the stories that matter in the fight to defend democracy. But the Democracy Docket team can't do it alone. For just $10 a month, you can help them keep producing conversations like this one, shining a light on the people and movements fighting for working Americans. Support Democracy Docket today today by clicking on the link in the description below.
It facilitates it. It further tilts the playing field because there are really important knock-on effects of exactly what you just said. And this similar stories can be told about universities, about private foundations, about CEOs, and about some media companies. Which is that these guys look around and they decide, just to be safe, that we're just not gonna support these progressive causes that might attract Stephen Miller's ire, right? Or Russ Vaught's ire. So you see universities not only dismantling DEI programs, which you can agree with or disagree with, but they were legal programs that universities had every right to retain and carry out or implement really unprecedented since the 1960s restrictions on campus protests, just to make sure that the Justice Department, the Education Department, that they don't get in the crosshairs of the administration. The fact that Big Law, and this is an area that you know much better than I, is not doing the pro bono work that it used to do. The fact that foundations, whether it's Gates or others, are pulling away from funding some controversial subjects that might be civil rights groups, that might be voting rights groups that they used to support, is weakening our democratic defenses. It's weakening our civil society. We have groups in civil society that are defending different causes that are clearly linked to democracy and civil rights, democratic rights, voting rights, that are not getting the legal defense that they might have gotten, that are not getting the funding that they might have gotten, that are having to lay off staff, and the cumulative effect of that is pretty serious. Universities are a place that are often key sites of resistance to authoritarianism. Students are often at the forefront of defending democracy or leading protests against authoritarianism. They are not right now. That's not entirely because of campus restrictions, but it has not helped that dozens, in fact, hundreds of universities and colleges have made it more difficult for students to protest. So the effects are very, very serious. That you're right. I don't know if it's abdication, but this anticipatory acquiescence, just to stay out of the crosshairs of the government, it allows the government to pick on a relatively small number of actors and yet intimidate a large chunk of civil society.
Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is because you're both an expert on sort of how democracies flourish and decay. You also have expertise in the role political parties play in that. And you wrote a very, very important book called Tyranny of the Minority. As you know, in the United States, there is this tradition from the founding about the importance of protecting minority rights against the tyranny of the majority. Political parties have played, a role in this process of ensuring that there is rights preservation. But oftentimes parties are a place in which these things can get worked out, and there can be a power center to challenge demagogues or authoritarians on the other side. Talk to me about how you think of those two things, majoritarianism. Is it good to frustrate majoritarianism? Is it bad to frustrate majoritarianism? Maybe. I guess the answer is it depends. Are political parties stabilizing forces in democracies, or are they, like we're seeing right now in the Republican Party, promoters of authoritarianism? Like, how do you make sense of those two questions?
There are various ways for democracies to mix these two different imperatives, right? Of empowering majorities and you don't have democracy if you don't empower majorities, while at the same time protecting minority rights. What Daniel Ziblatt and I have argued is that there are certain minority rights, there's certain places where majorities can never be allowed to go. Even though in general, you always want to empower majorities, there are a couple areas where majorities can't go. One is a set of basic rights, voting rights, civil rights, basic rights of freedom of speech, assembly, association, protest. They can never be violated, even by somebody who wins 99% of the vote. The other is the democratic process itself. You can't use a temporary majority to change the rules of the game to stack the deck against your opponents, right? The opposition, the partisan minority, the guys who lose elections today have a right to fair competition tomorrow. And so you can't use your majority to violate basic individual rights. You can't use your majority to tilt the playing field. Beyond that, in other areas, I think it's really important that majorities be empowered. For example, elections. The folks who win the most votes should win power in elections. There's really no excuse for that ever not being the case. And also in general, here some will disagree, and this is why I'm an opponent of the filibuster. Legislative majorities should be able to govern. If you win the most votes, not only should you win the election, but you should be able to govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to systematically and permanently thwart legislative majorities, which is what has been happening in recent decades in the United States. So as long as those majorities pass laws that are constitutional, that are not rights violating, they should pass. I think one problem in U.S. democracy, which is very counter-majoritarian, we have the most anti-majoritarian constitution among all democracies in the world, is that majorities have we've always protected ourselves from majorities. Since the founding, we've been very good at that. But at times we've been too good, and it has prevented majorities, important majorities, in favor of, say, of gun control, or in favor of some aspects of basic redistribution, a higher minimum wage. We see years and years of polls showing 65, 70, 75% of Americans in favor of gun control not being able to get it through the legislature. And there, I think some of the protections for partisan minorities have really sort of undermined our democracy and left many Americans feeling like majorities aren't listened to at all.
I want to go back to competitive authoritarianism because I think it's a very important concept at this moment in American history, maybe in world history. Until I had heard this phrase from you, what I had been telling folks is that that to have a successful democracy, it has to be a liberal democracy. In other words, you have to pair liberalism, not liberalism in the sense of liberal versus conservative in policies in the United States, not that, but individual liberties, respect for basic dignity and freedoms. That what we've seen is a growth of illiberal democracies around the world, and that illiberal democracies really are not democratic in any meaningful way, because you can't really divorce the two. And I'm now wondering if what I was really struggling towards getting towards is something more akin to what you're describing as competitive authoritarianism. Talk to me about whether whether liberalism, respect for human rights, for basic fundamental rights of individuals, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, whether that is essential to democracy, whether this is connected to what you have is competitive authoritarianism if you have illiberal democracy, or if these are different concepts.
I think you mostly answered the question, or at least my view is very similar to what you implied, which is that, in my view, not everyone agrees, you really cannot have an illiberal democracy, at least not for very long, because basic liberal rights, free press, free speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, is essential to opposition, right? If you take away those rights, even if you're popularly elected, so there's no question that Hugo Chavez was, he was clearly popularly elected. Orban was popularly elected, or his party was. That part was clear. But then if on day one or year one of your administration, you strip away the right to get access to alternative information, the right to criticize the government, the right to publish against the government, organize against the government, protest against the government, you are tilting the playing field inevitably against the opposition. If you do not afford citizens a broad array of liberal rights, the opposition cannot oppose the government on a fair playing field. And so almost immediately, you're creating a system that's less democratic, because the opposition can't inform itself, can't speak out, can't organize against you. To my knowledge, there's never been an illiberal democracy that didn't tilt into competitive authoritarianism really immediately. that's why many years ago when Luke and Wei and I came up with the term competitive authoritarianism, we dismissed terms like illiberal democracy as really not making much sense. This is, once you move away from liberal democracy, you're moving into some form of hybrid, some form of non-democratic system.
I thought what you were going to turn to was the US Senate and the way in which we district for House. I mean, there's a lot of people who think that the way in which our legislative bodies are chosen and the way in which the Electoral College operates is fundamentally inconsistent with democracy. But then on the other hand, I find myself fascinated. I know very little about it, but I find myself fascinated whenever there is a French election and I watch the experts explain how these French elections work. And they also seem to have a very sort of indirect manner of voting. I know in Great Britain, there are essentially the equivalent of districts, right, that they elect from. Is there anything about the way in which the US system, the Electoral College, the Senate, the House, does not, meet the definition of democracy, as sometimes you hear critics say, or is it within the 40 yard lines, of democracies?
I think, U.S. pre 2016, pre Trump, was within the 40-yard lines. There are a great diversity of electoral rules in the world, as you know very well. You mentioned some of them. And yeah, I think an argument can be made, I'll make it briefly in a second, that the U.S. system is in some ways less democratic than exists in places with proportional representation. And certainly the Electoral College is less democratic. But most scholars, and I would agree with them, believe that it's within bounds of democracy. There are a few problems with the U.S. system. I'll point quickly to three. The most obvious is the Electoral College. We are the only presidential democracy on earth where the loser of the popular vote for president, the person who wins fewer votes for president, can legitimately become president. Doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened twice in recent memory. And it can happen at any election. That's a pretty undemocratic institution. I also think the U.S. Senate, which gives every state equal representation, regardless of population. So the Senate represents territory. It represents land, not people. A democracy is supposed to be ruled by the people, not by the land. Senators representing 15-20% of the United States can block legislation or impose legislation is absurd from a democratic standpoint. Very, very quickly, the other system that is somewhat problematic, it's obviously consistent with democracy because the Canadians do it, the Brits do it, we do it, is plurality electoral systems where we elect a single member per district and the party that wins the most votes wins.
So explain to people what the alternative would look like.
The alternative is a proportional representation system where you elect multiple people from a district. Could be a state, could be a larger district, but each district elects multiple candidates, and parties compete with lists, and they get the number of candidates elected that is more or less proportional to the percentage of the vote that they win. So if 10 candidates are up and one party wins 60% of the vote, they get 6 candidates. If another party gets 40% of the vote, they get the other 4. And so the percentage of the vote maps more directly onto the percentage of the seats you get in Congress. The problem with the plurality system, and Britain actually has this more acutely than we do, is that a party can win 35% of the vote nationally and win a majority in the legislature. I mean, that could happen in the next few years with the far right Reform Party in the UK. It's more democratic, in my view anyway, that there be a pretty close mapping between the percentage of the vote that a party gets and the percentage of the legislature that it wins. The more that it's distorted, the less democratic it is. And of course, in the US, uniquely, gerrymandering distorts it much, much more. So the US system is compatible with democracies, but I think there are other systems that are, at least at the margins, a bit more democratic.
Does the fact that we have a stable, I mean, not immutable, it's changed over history a handful of times, but that we have a relatively stable two-party system, Does that make it more democratic? I could see the argument to say it is actually more democratic. I could also see the argument that people make who say there should be no, you'd be better off with third parties and a more, as you see in other countries like Great Britain, where you have more fluidity of the parties. Does that matter one way or the other?
We know that both two-party systems and multi-party systems have been fully compatible with stable and successful democracy. There's no single recipe. Democracies get into trouble or they're healthy for reasons other than the party system. I think a pretty good argument could be made, as Lee Drutman does, that we could shake ourselves out of this sort of very dangerous dysfunctional polarization more easily if we had a multi-party system. But the U.S. democracy has been very healthy with a two-party system in the past. So the two-party system is not the problem.
I take comfort from the fact that you began with the note that wealthy democracies don't fail. And what was the other one? The ones that have been around, old ones. But we are where we are. So let's take the optimistic case. What is the way in which a democracy that is in the place we are in, which is showing the signs of competitive authoritarianism, how do they ever reverse? You can see competitive authoritarianism escalating, but how does it de-escalate? Like, when is the time? How does it get that people say, you know what, I'm going to give up a tool of power that the other side used? How does this do anything other than create a race to just continuously find ways of rigging the system against the other side?
Slides into competitive authoritarianism get reversed all the time. And it usually occurs, not always, but it usually occurs through elections. I mean, as long as elections are minimally competitive, even in cases where there's some shenanigans, some fraud, some abuse of power, oppositions often find ways to win elections. This is an extreme case, but in Venezuela, the regime was so repressive last year that the opposition campaign was literally underground and online. They couldn't even go out in the streets and campaign, and they still won 70% of the vote. They won 2-1, despite total repression. Now the government stole the election afterwards, but elections are the primary way in which autocrats and contemporary competitive authoritarian regimes lose power. And that's an important step, but that doesn't resolve the problem you were pointing to. It doesn't turn back the clock to the days when politicians were restrained by norms. We don't have many examples. Quite frankly, we don't have many examples of countries beginning that spiral and kind of turning back and saying, okay, no, we're going to get off this train. There are some cases where things polarize and escalate and the country goes over the cliff into civil war, dictatorship. I think of Spain in the 30s, or obviously Germany or Chile in the 1970s. And then after experiencing dictatorship, 10 or 20 or 40 years of dictatorship, then political elites come together and say, wow, we have to do things differently, as they have in Spain and Chile and Germany. We don't obviously want to go there. There also are paths of countries remaining just stably unstable, in the sense that politicians play rough. They often tilt the playing field when in power, but they don't have enough strength to consolidate power, and so they do lose. And it's a little bit like a game of King of the Hill. Like, the guy on top plays dirty, but the guy on top gets removed, and you have unstable politics. A lot of Latin America and parts of sub-Saharan Africa in the last 30, 40 years have been kind of unstable, competitive authoritarian regimes that don't escalate to the point of going over the cliff, but politics is pretty bare knuckle, and it doesn't produce great outcomes. The good news in the United States is that the worst case scenario is one side just wins, right? Venezuela or El Salvador today, or Turkey or Hungary. A better scenario, not ideal, a better scenario is when the opposition has enough strength to at least keep winning elections and you get turnover. Turnover is critical. Once these guys are in power for a decade or so, it gets much, much harder to separate them from the state. So turnover gives at least the possibility of one, preventing these guys from entrenching themselves, and two, creates the possibility of some kind of an understanding or agreement that, okay, this, we got to get off this merry-go-round.
Would you say that Mexico was an example of that? Didn't Mexico have one party rule for like decades?
Yeah, Mexico had a revolution that brought a single party to power for 80 years, became a democracy in the late 1990s, and now has a mildly competitive authoritarian regime, a little bit like the United States, but with a power asymmetry that's much worse than the United States. The ruling party in Mexico today is very popular. It's very strong. The opposition is divided and discredited. So whereas the Democratic Party, thankfully, as much as we complain about the Democratic Party, we have a united opposition with a well-financed, well-organized, electorally viable political party. That is a treasure. That is something that no other opposition in any other competitive authoritarian regime I know has. Mexico doesn't have that. So the asymmetry of power favors the government in a way that's not true today in the United States.
The Supreme Court of the United States, in a series of cases involving redistricting, went from saying essentially partisan redistricting is maybe illegal, but we really don't know yet. We can't, we don't have enough benchmarks to figure it out, to partisan gerrymandering is bad and probably illegal, but it's so impossible to figure out how to measure it and how to gauge it. We're just going to declare it outside the realm of the courts. That's honestly, if people want to know where we are jurisprudentially today, technically that's where we are. Where the courts seem to be going, like literally as we are recording this, is to reclassify partisan gerrymandering as actually not an ill at all. And what I'm worried about is that if you take that jurisprudential mindset and you start to apply it to all election rules, combined with big technology, and one of the things I've been sort of a very loud voice on is that everyone can intuit that the ability to use big data and artificial intelligence is allowing the drawing of districts right now. What happens when that starts to be turned on other voting rules? The citing of polling locations, the allocation of voting equipment to create longer lines, the closing of streets. I'm worried about this merger of a jurisprudence that is kind of like fine with hyperpartisanship married with technology that can exploit that. And I'm wondering if you share that concern, if there's any historical precedent for that, or if this is just uncharted territory.
This is a product of a court that is ill-prepared to deal with authoritarianism and a really antiquated electoral system that allows for partisan control of the electoral administration. We're a very old republic, and we've been doing it this way for a very long time. And it was fine for a very long time because the parties weren't very polarized, and the stakes of elections weren't considered very, very high, and so nobody cared to invest heavily in figuring out the precise way to defeat the opposition. But we have had instances of this in the past. We've had all sorts of fraud in U.S. cities in the past. And of course, we had the Jim Crow South, which was a blatant abuse of electoral rule, a plethora of electoral rules blessed by the court. There are two possible ways out of this. First of all, the court could, in theory, be much more aggressive about defending democracy. This court, I mean, these guys were not brought up to think about defending democracy, but the Brazilian Supreme Court has been very, very aggressive in intervening at efforts, including stopping police actions, blocking streets on election day in the last election in Brazil. This started happening, and the Supreme Court stepped in immediately and said the police had to stop blocking the streets. So the court could, if these guys were to conclude that democracy is really under threat, the courts could be much more aggressive. But ultimately, in a polarized context, we need to have an independent electoral administration. I know that's not easy in the United States, where that's not imminent. But in the medium run, there's no way that you can have extreme partisanship. And to be honest, an authoritarian party in the Republican Party, a party that is willing to, win by any means. They've demonstrated that. You cannot have partisan control of the election administration combined with hyperpolarization, parties willing to win by cheating, and the technological advances you talk about. It is inevitable that you'll get an abuse of power, an abuse of your control over the electoral authorities to tilt the playing field. All of these things that you're talking about, gerrymandering, uh, road closures, location of ballot boxes, wait lines, all this stuff, it tilts the electoral playing field. Tilting the electoral playing field is by definition anti-democratic. It is not compatible with democracy. And I don't know when the Roberts Court is going to come to the conclusion that that's true.
So I have to go back to one thing you said, which I just find remarkable because I don't know anything about Hungary. I don't know anything about their democracy, but to hear people talk about Orban is to hear people talk about someone who is pretty much an authoritarian. And you're saying he actually has not cracked down on, in some ways that Trump has. I've assumed he controls the ballot boxes and the ballot counting. Are you saying that they've actually had like honest counting of ballots there?
Yes. There is partisan control over the electoral administration. So Hungary, like the vast majority of democracies, and I think all European democracies, has an independent authority, in effect, a fourth branch of government that oversees elections. But since Fidesz won a super majority in the parliament, they were able to appoint, especially, and since they've been in power 15 years, they've been able to appoint all the leaders of it. So it's now run by partisans of Orban. It is a real bureaucracy with civil servants, and to date, they have not stolen, to my knowledge, a single vote. What the electoral administration has done is gerrymander quite heavily. So that, the first re-election of Orban in 2014 was like the state of Texas dream plan. They lost 7 or 8 percentage points in the vote, and they didn't lose any seats in parliament. They retained the supermajority despite plunging from 50-something% of the vote to 40-something% of the vote, which is what Trump was looking for in Texas with his gerrymandering. So they haven't made elections fraudulent, but they've made them less fair.
The biggest question I get is from, everyday Americans who are not lawyers, they're not Harvard professors, and they feel powerless. And so, there was something going around about if a certain percentage of the population shows up at a protest, something magical happens. And I don't mean to dismiss that. Maybe it's true. But is there, what is the thing that ordinary Americans can do to prevent authoritarianism?
This is going to sound like a punt, and but I really mean it, and I think it's very important. Americans have to be engaged. They have to, first of all, not retreat to the sideline. You could be disengaged either because you're overconfident and you believe, oh, well, we've always been a democracy. Democracy can't possibly be in danger. You can be overconfident, or you could decide, the game's up. Trump's going to rig it. They're just going to, and so we give up. No, we have to stay engaged. This is an authoritarian government. This is an unprecedented assault on our institutions, but it's beatable. And the backsliding we have suffered is clearly reversible. It's been reversible in other countries, is reversible here. So people have to engage. They have to pay attention, and they have to be active in politics, really broadly defined, meaning whatever issue you care about. And there are 500 different issues. For some people, it's election integrity. For other people, it's abortion. For other people, it's corruption. For other people, it's the environment. For other people, it's unions. There are inequality. There are minimum wage, gun laws. There are 1,000 different things. Be engaged on the issues that you care about. Be engaged, and meaning not just Facebook likes, but go out, go to meetings. It's probably not going to be 10 million people marching on Washington, bringing down Trump. It's probably not going to be a color revolution. But if we have tens of millions of Americans who are engaged in politics, who are aware of what's going on, and who are pushing back when their issue comes up, and maybe it's a Tuesday, or maybe it's next month, or maybe it's in 6 months, but are there in their organization ready and willing to push back, we're in a much better place than when everybody just gives up. We need to have 20, 30 million Americans active and engaged and delivering. This government is going to be weakened slowly. It's going to bleed itself slowly. Fortunately, it's picked too many fights, and it's making a lot of enemies. And it's beginning just the last month or two to suffer some defeats. Those defeats are being inflicted in many cases by ordinary Americans. Sometimes it's judges, but ordinary Americans are inflicting these defeats. That's an engaged populace. We probably won't be a single spectacular event. There's not one single cause. There's not one single organization, but everybody's got to be engaged. We have to have, I guess it's some faith, or I would say confidence, that if each of us does get engaged and each of us works, that the collective effect of 20 or 30 million engaged Americans is going to be substantial, is going to move things. I think we're seeing that. I mean, we talked earlier about how our elite responded pretty pathetically to Trump's authoritarian offensive. Americans have done, they get a better grade, right? If the elite gets a D minus, maybe Americans don't get an A plus, but from the protests at the Tesla dealerships early in 2025 through the No Kings protests, but also town halls, letter writing campaigns, consumer boycotts, Americans have been engaged, and we are beginning to see the effects of that. Trump is weaker today than he was 4 or 5 months ago, and that's because Americans have begun to push back.